Great, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to the committee for accepting my presentation as a podium presentation. And I feel really honored to be here with my husband and baby, newborn baby. He's only 9 weeks old. So I feel really blessed to be here as a new mom. Thank you. Thank you. I had all these false choices in my head. Do I pick my career? Do I pick my family? Can I have both? And I realized that it's really important to live a coherent life and that we can contribute to society and we can also have a family. So yeah, I feel really, really blessed to be here. Thank you. So yeah, my name is Anisa Rohani Farid. I've just completed my postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Maryland in Baltimore. And I'm now a full-time mom. And I'm presenting the findings of my paper with my mentor, Joe Ross, and a couple of others who are displayed here on the analysis of reporting consistency between clinical trials presented at major medical conferences, their corresponding publications, and press releases. So before we get started, regarding conflicts of interest, we weren't supported by any external grants or funds, but here are our funding sources. Okay, great. Okay, so as we all know, clinical trials are the gold standard for testing the efficacy and safety of drugs and interventions. And typically the first place where people present the findings of their trials is at a major medical conference. So their abstracts get published just like ours are published, and they're disseminated widely, typically sometimes published online, as well as paper. Drug companies often release press releases beforehand that they're going to be presenting the findings of their trial at such and such conference. Representatives of the media are also present and there to capture the evidence that's being shared, and they widely disseminate that to the public, and patients hear about it through that as well. So we realize that there's a huge downstream effect of the results of trials that are presented at these conferences. So clinical trial integrity is so important at these conferences, and it has to do with the fact that there's a lot of pressure to present novel findings, as we know, at these conferences. And researchers can be particularly prone to spin at these conferences as well, because of this whole publish and perish phenomenon where, they're like, okay, well, I'm here, I'm in front of the conference, I'm in front of lots of people, I better present something really exciting to the audience. So, there's a huge risk of having flawed medical evidence, which could then have a negative impact on patient care. Thank you. So we can see in this cartoon by Hilda Bastian, a kind of a pictorial depiction of what happens when researchers spin or distort their findings. And various practices have been employed to spin results. These include inappropriate claims, inappropriate extrapolations or recommendations for clinical practice, selective reporting, or more robust or favorable data presentations. So clinical trialists, as I mentioned, could be spinning their findings at these conferences in order to make their presentations more interesting and pleasing to the audience. So if abstracts at these conferences don't present an accurate representation and unbiased reflection of trial results, patients might suffer serious consequences. So our research question then was, is research from global medical conferences consistently reported? We didn't really study spin. I think that's, others have studied spin, and, that's probably the next step from our study, but we wanted to measure, is there consistency of reporting between what was there at the conference, what was presented, and then what was actually published in the end. So there's been previous research, so Thoma et al., they looked at the consistency of reporting of the degree of consistency of reporting between meeting abstract and subsequent publications of late-breaking randomized controlled trials presented at the American College of Cardiology scientific meeting from 1999 to 2002. So they found that late-breaking clinical trials were less likely to report favorable results for the intervention and more likely to be published than the comparison clinical trials presented in other sessions. So the authors also identified here that 41% of trials that were subsequently published exhibited discrepancies between the efficacy estimate reported in the meeting abstract versus the one reported in the subsequent publication for the primary outcome. So the discrepancy rate was the same for late-breaking trials versus those in other sessions. So these previous evaluations have looked at discrepancy of reporting at typically one conference, like the American College of Cardiology scientific meeting, but our study, what was unique about it was that we studied a whole cross-section of conferences. So as I mentioned, we addressed this gap in the literature, and our study was designed from a research transparency and integrity perspective. And the objective of our study was to examine the extent to which trials presented at major international medical conferences consistently reported their study design, endpoints, and results across conference abstracts, published articles, and we also looked at press releases. So to examine this, we did a cross-sectional analysis of trials presented at 12 conferences in the United States in 2016. Conferences were identified from a list prepared by the Healthcare Convention and Exhibitors Association, which is a trade association that wrote a report of the major medical conferences in the United States. And we looked at that report and we identified 12 conferences that reported their abstracts publicly online. So that was the inclusion criteria. And so we included, abstracts were included if they were abstracts were included, all late breaker abstracts were included, and other trials were randomly selected, bringing the total sample up to 25 per abstract per conference. So in terms of our design, first we wanted to see, okay, well, how many of these trials were actually registered and how many of them reported their results at our ICMJE approved trial registry. Second, we determined if the trial results were published in a peer-reviewed journal. Third, we wanted to collect information on media coverage and press releases, and we used LexisNexis for that. And finally, which was kind of like the main focus of our media coverage and press releases was through LexisNexis. And finally, we looked at consistency measures, and this was the main kind of overall outcome of our study. So we wanted to compare if those that were published, the trials that were published had consistency on these various factors. So did they have consistent primary efficacy endpoints? So did they kind of switch their outcomes from what they shared at the conference versus what they actually published? What about safety endpoint? If they mentioned something about safety in their conference, did they actually mention something about safety in their publication as well? Was the sample size the same? What about the follow-up period? And what about the effect size? Was that the same as well? And finally, for the characterization of results, so this was whether they were positively characterized, which meant that the primary outcome was positive, and they found a negative outcome for the secondary endpoint, a neutral outcome, so they didn't find anything for the primary, but they found something for the secondary, and finally negative, so they didn't find anything for either the primary or the secondary endpoints. So, I have, if anyone's interested, I have the list of the 12 conferences as well. And in terms of statistical methods, our primary analyses were descriptive, and our secondary analyses use chi-squared and multiple logistic regression. And in terms of the characteristics that were included in our model, we had any relevant combination of those characteristics, such as late breaker status. The primary purpose of the trial was a therapeutic or diagnostic, the funder status, industry funded, academia funded, government, or any combination of these, and also the conference meeting. So, did that impact whether or not they had consistent reporting? So here's an example of how we extracted our data. So we have to identify the abstract. So this is an abstract from ASCO. I identified the registration information and the summary results. I found the publication and then the media coverage. So there's like a press release. And I'm sorry, whether it was covered by the media, and here's a press release. As to our results, so we had 240 clinical trials in our final sample, and of these, 208, so 66%, 86.7% were registered, 95, so 39.6 reported summary results in a registry, and 177, so 73.8 were actually published. So still there's about a quarter of trials that weren't published. So 82, so 34.2% were covered by the media, and 68, so 28.3 had press releases. So up next, I'm going to be focusing on that yellow arrow there. I'm going to be focusing on comparing the consistency of these trials that were actually published, comparing conference abstract to publication abstract. So in terms of our results here, so among the 177 published trials, 171, so 96.6 reported consistent primary efficacy endpoints. So that's actually quite high, and I think we were kind of surprised by that. And among the 128 trials for which safety endpoints were reported in either the conference abstract or publication, 75% were consistent, so it's a little bit lower there. There were around 62% of trials with consistent sample size across abstracts, 3/4 that reported their follow-up periods consistently, half that described their effect sizes consistently, and around 90% that characterized the results consistently. So again, that's quite high. So a few takeaways from this are that while a quarter of trials did not proceed to publication, nearly all that did consistently reported their primary efficacy endpoint. And among the trials that were published and had press releases, 32 out of 32, so 100% of them, had consistent reporting for the characterization of results. And as to our comparisons, no trial characteristics were associated with reporting primary efficacy endpoints consistently. And another point was the peer reviewers of our abstract mentioned that we did another analysis, and it was interesting to note that trial registration was not associated with better consistency of reporting. Conclusions, and I think my time is up. So again, this study demonstrates that trials presented at major medical conferences are consistently reporting primary efficacy endpoints and results characterization of conference abstracts and publication abstracts, although only 3/4 were actually published. Reporting of other study characteristics were lower and less consistent, particularly safety endpoints. It could be that authors are presenting preliminary data and we didn't collect information on that during data extraction, so we couldn't do another analysis to look into that. So it could be that they're presenting preliminary data with shorter follow-up periods and smaller sample sizes due to incomplete patient recruitment and consequently varying effect sizes. However, our findings do not rule out that the possibility of misreporting at conferences or publications, and nor can we actually investigate what people said or how they characterized their results when speaking at the meetings themselves. And so this brings me to the end of my talk. Thank you so much for listening. I would like to take any questions. And also before that, I want to acknowledge all these institutions that have supported this research to come to completion. The people at Yale, my advisor at the University of Maryland, and I would particularly like to say thank you to my mentor, Joe Ross at Yale, who's always supported me and encouraged me and has still encouraged me and supporting me to continue my research career. My colleague Hong, who's sitting here, who did the study with me side by side, my advisor, Peter Doshi at the University of Maryland, and Sarah Tenvier, my colleague there, and my newborn baby, Kelsey, and my husband, Alan, who I couldn't have completed the study without their support. So thank you all for listening, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Anissa.
Thank you, Anissa. Hi, I'm Shelley Brownage from the University of Split School of Medicine. Yep. Anissa and I worked together on your RIAT campaign with Professor Dashi. My question is similar, is surrounding actually what you all did with the RIAT campaign. Would you be interested in asking the conference organizers or the editors of these journals where the discrepant information was reported? Would you consider asking for an erratum, some type of acknowledgement of the discrepancy?
Thanks, Shelley. That's such a good question. And actually, when I started at Riot, I posed that same idea to Peter. I was like, hey, I'm doing this study that's looking at inconsistency. Maybe we could write expressions of concern about some of these trials that have been maybe inconsistently reported, but I haven't followed up on that idea. I wrote a bunch of other expressions of concern, but that's a good idea, and maybe we can look into that. Thank you, Shelley.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ivan Oransky from Retraction Watch, but maybe more relevant to my question, previously editorial director and vice president of editorial at Medscape and MedPage Today. So I think I may have missed it, but you were also obviously presenting lots in a short period of time. So I was curious to see a bit more about how media outlets reported on this, because was that all sort of part of one composite endpoint that you were looking at?
Yeah, good question.
And I'm just gonna, so I can just get to my question, and then you can be, you can have time. You said LexisNexis, and I'm curious because they don't typically capture trade publications, which is why it was relevant where I used to work, and I'm curious if that was part of your analysis.
Yeah, thank you. So as to the media coverage variable, it was just yes, no. So it was dichotomous. Was it covered by the media, yes or no? We didn't look at what they actually said, what they actually reported in their media outlet reports. But for press releases, we did look at how they characterize the results of the trial. So that was in our analysis. And as to LexisNexis, I used it just simply to see what was covered, if anything was covered by the media. And if I didn't find anything in LexisNexis, we looked at Google as well, just to kind of look at, was there anything covered? This was a really hard exercise because we're looking at trials published a long time ago. Even finding their registration information was really difficult. So some of our recommendations are trials need to have better reporting of all the different factors that are connected with their trials, their funder status, their registration number. So just better reporting of abstracts for sure. But thank you for asking that, and I hope I answered it okay. Awesome.
Let's hear from our virtual attendees. I'm going to combine two questions from Diane Kelsall at CMAJ and Bahar Memani at Elsevier. Did you find differences in consistency versus inconsistency by variables of registration, prospective versus retrospective, or by sample size, bigger or smaller?
We didn't do that type of analysis, so I'm unable to I didn't look into whether they were prospectively or retrospectively registered. So I can't answer that question. And we didn't do a sample size analysis either. So
future research, right?
Future research, I'm sharing my data. So, you know, if anyone wants to go back and go into the data and do more analyses, they're welcome to do that.
Go in the back.
Thank you. If I understand the key takeaway, it was that there's some reassurance that the meeting abstract and the final report were pretty consistent. In a lot of situations, an abstract is presented at a meeting as a late breaker with almost concurrent publication.
Yeah.
Did you look at the difference in time between those two events to see if that affected the consistency? Because I suspect that.
That's a really cool idea. I didn't look into that. Yeah, but that would have been really interesting to see if time, you know, changed anything there. Thank you.
Cameron Abbasi from BMJ. Hello.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, good work. Well
Thank
done. Two questions. Did you look at the outcomes of the trials that weren't reported, that didn't get published? Well, I mean, were they more likely to be negative trials? Did you look at that?
The outcomes of the trials that weren't published? No, we didn't look into
Okay.
that. Yeah, we have data on that though. So
okay.
yeah.
And then secondly, I mean, I mean, good that there was some consistency, but you've noted some discrepancies.
Yeah.
You're assuming that the editing process made papers better, but do you know that?
I can't confidently say that. I don't know if the editing process made papers better. All I know is that there was a high level of consistency between what was reported in the conference and what was actually ended up publishing. But for the ones that didn't report consistent safety or didn't report, you know, there was only 75% of trials reported consistent safety. So, you know, I can't say confidently that the editorial process made reporting better, but I do hope that conferences can employ the guidelines so that, you know, people at conferences can accurately report what it is that they're actually studying. Yeah.
Hi, Steve Woloshin, Dartmouth and the Lisa Schwartz Foundation. That was a very interesting study. 3 peer-reviewed congresses ago, Lisa and I presented a paper sort of like it, a little different. We started out with a bunch of the big meetings and looked at what got media coverage and then looked backwards to see. So because our interest was in what gets out to the public, and a lot of stuff doesn't get published. So more than a quarter of the papers that received media coverage, including front page media coverage, were never subsequently published, at least over a 3 to 5 year time frame. So you have an opportunity with your data set, I think, to reproduce that, which is would answer a different question, but I think, you know, a very interesting question. The second thing is, I don't think consistency is a great outcome because, you know, you may have consistently bad stuff. And we, in another paper that we did, this was in BMJ, we showed that there's a good, strong correlation between what's in the press release and what's in the subsequent media coverage. That's true. But if a press release is bad, the media coverage was bad. If the press release was good, the media coverage was good. So they both were consistent. You want one to be consistent, you want the other not to be.
Yeah,
consistent.
I really like that question. Thank you for raising that. And actually, that was one of our limitations, that maybe we're overestimating consistency because, you know, when you go to clinicaltrials.gov, for instance, sometimes trialists register like 10 primary outcomes. So it could be that they're consistently misreporting their primary outcome. So that was something that I, you know, kind of flagged when I was going through and looking at some of the registration information. I thought, wow, you know, I'm not a clinical trial expert at all, but, you know, after doing this and looking at so many trials and looking at their primary efficacy endpoints, I was kind of surprised that, you know, sometimes you can register so many different primary outcomes. So I don't know, maybe maybe our estimate is actually we're overestimating consistency. And yet another limitation was, we didn't study the nuances of spin. We didn't assess the direction of the bias. So, you know, again, the data is there. We could do future research to look into that as well. Any more questions?
I think that's it.
Thank you.
So much.
Appreciate it.